Hello, and welcome to our Finance Toolbox series provided by Frost Brown Todd and its affiliate, FBT Project Finance Advisors, and presented on CDFA TV. The title of this episode is Public-Private Partnership, or P3, Financing for Energy. My name is Brian Zoller, and I am a member with Frost Brown Todd. I primarily focus on advising clients on project development, including utility-scale solar projects and landfill gas-to-energy projects. Joining me today are Andrew Redinger from KeyBank and Laura Thielman, also from Frost Brown Todd. Andrew manages KeyBank Capital Markets North America utility, power, and renewable energy practice. With more than 20 years of energy experience, Andrew has provided specialized investment banking services to some of North America's largest utility and renewable energy companies. Under his leadership, KeyBank Capital Markets has built a national utility, power, and renewable energy practice, committed over $5 billion of their balance sheet to utility and renewable energy clients, successfully advised numerous utility and renewable energy companies in private capital raises, acquisitions and divestiture assignments, and structured and financed over 3 gigawatts of renewable energy projects. Laura assists a broad range of clients, including nonprofit corporations, educational facilities, state and local governments, as well as manufacturing clients, successfully plan, structure, and complete their capital, financing, and commercial projects. She has served as bond counsel, underwriters counsel, trustees counsel, counsel to for-profit, nonprofit, and governmental entities, and counsel to conduit borrowers in many types of transactions, including interim financings, variable rate and fixed rate debt issuances, general obligation debt issuances, pooled financings, various governmental economic development incentives, and financing leases.
Well, thanks, Brian, for that introduction. Again, I'm Andy Redinger. I lead KeyBank's Utility Power Renewable Energy Group, and it's a pleasure to be here today. What I'd like to do is really 5 things. I want to introduce what a typical deal structure looks like. I want to talk a little bit about the sources of capital. Then I'll drill down a little bit into those sources of capital, which include tax equity, debt, and cash equity. And then finally discuss a couple common deal structures out there. If I say project level versus back levered financing, I'll get into that towards the end of the presentation. Well, let me start first by showing you what a typical renewable deal structure looks like. And there's really several components to that. And most importantly, it's really the offtake agreements. And the offtake agreements come in various forms. You can have a PPA with a utility company. You can also have a hedge as an offtake agreement. And then also you could sell the power on the spot market. But to be a financeable project, you need to have those offtake agreements lined up, and any one of those are financeable in the marketplace. The other things that you need to have lined up, a lot of states have renewable energy credits that projects are eligible for. Sometimes you have those lined up to be whatever the project generates, you have those credits lined up, and you have a buyer for those credits prior to pursuing financing. But the most important thing, if you have a project you think is ready to be financed, is obviously you want all of the permits, all the local permits, all of the things you need to start construction of that project. And then from a financing perspective, it's most important to have those offtake agreements in place. And then you're ready to go get financing. And there's really 3 sources of capital to help build your project. And those are cash equity, debt, and tax equity. And typically, we have financed over $10 billion worth of projects. And typically, the way the capital structure works is, and this is a general rule of thumb, but debt typically will provide 40 to 50% of the capital structure. Tax equity will provide another 40 to 50%, and then cash equity is usually the hole that gets filled. It's usually somewhere around 10 to 20%. But those are the three sources of capital that you would pursue to build your project. Drilling down a little bit into tax equity, and this, most of the developers, in fact, the vast majority of developers that are building projects, constructing projects, don't have the taxable income to utilize all the tax benefits that the projects produce. So what they end up doing is they go out and find a third-party investor to buy those tax benefits. And the structure of those tax benefits is usually through a partnership flip. So the developer will package up those tax benefits, which includes an investment tax credit or a production tax credit. It depends on whether the project's wind or solar. And they'll also package up the depreciation. And they'll sell those tax benefits to a third party through a partnership flip structure. And what that third party will do is the third party they have return requirements typically in that 6 to 8% range. So they'll give the project owner an investment, again, 40 to 50% typically of project development costs. And in return, they will get 95% typically of all of the cash distributions until they hit the preferred yield flip. That typically takes about 5 years. And then once the tax equity investor hits their preferred yield, the partnership flips, and then the sponsor then gets 95% of all cash distributions from there on. And the tax equity partner gets 5% of the distributions. The sponsor has the ability, after the tax equity partner reaches their preferred return, to buy out that tax equity investor. And that's usually what happens in these deals. After the tax equity investor receives its preferred return, typically in the first 5 years, they're getting all of the cash distributions. After the partnership flips, the sponsor typically then buys them out and collapses the deal into them being the sole owner. The next piece of capital that we want to talk about is debt. And debt is widely available in this marketplace. Most of the projects have accessed the bank market versus the institutional market for their debt. Banks tend to be a little bit more aggressive in leveraging up the projects. But how these projects size the debt is typically, we look at the production, whether it's wind or solar. So we look at the production of wind, the production of solar. We calculate the number of kilowatt hours that are produced at each site. We determine the probability of that production. And if I say P99, banks size the debt based on a probability of a certain amount of production over a year period. So P99 means I'm 99% certain that this production will happen at this site. Banks use third-party engineers to help determine what that production level is. So we underwrite at a pretty conservative level. We ask the engineers to tell us what is the certainty of having this production, or give me the 99% certainty of having a certain production over a year period of time. And that's what we underwrite to. So we'll underwrite to a debt service coverage ratio of 1.3 to 1.5 times that certain production, which will help us size the debt over the contracted length of the project. So for example, if a project has a 20-year offtake agreement or a PPA, as I mentioned earlier, we'll look at the cash flow generated by that project over that 20-year period, and we'll size it at a 1.2 times DSCR, or 1.2 to 1.5, depending on the characteristics of the project, and we'll come up with the amount of leverage that is attributable to that project. Again, it varies slightly, but that's typically how we size the debt. Moving on then to, when we size the debt, that's the permanent piece I was mentioning or talking about. There's also a construction piece of debt that's available. Construction is there's two components to construction. It's the construction debt piece is sized very similar to the permanent piece, and in fact, it's exactly the same. But the other component of providing a construction loan is what we call a tax equity bridge loan. That tax equity bridge loan we size by taking 95% of the committed tax equity amount. That tax equity investor doesn't come into the deal until COD. So during construction, there is a hole to fill, which banks will more than willingly do. They will bridge to that tax equity investor coming in at the end of the construction. So the two pieces of construction debt are made up of the permanent piece and the tax equity piece. Once the project reaches COD, the tax equity investor comes in, takes out the tax equity bridge loan, and then the construction piece, which is also called the permanent piece, just converts to an amortizing piece of debt. These debt deals are structured typically as mini perms, meaning they're sized and amortized over the length of the contracted cash flows, but there's a maturity typically at 7 years. So they'll amortize, let's say, over 20 years, but there will be a maturity in that 7 to 10 year range. Okay, moving on to construction debt. Construction debt is sized the same as permanent financing. The difference in finding construction debt for your project versus permanent debt is construction debt also needs to fund tax equity's commitment. Tax equity does not fund until COD. So during construction, not only do you need construction leverage, which in effect will be the same size as what you figured out for your permanent debt, but you'll need to bridge that tax equity investor who does not come in until COD. So what banks in the market typically has been doing is they bridging that to that tax equity takeout, and we'll bridge 95% of their commitment. So during construction, typically on these projects, we'll leverage these things up 80 to 90% between the construction loan, which again is equal to the permanent loan, and the tax equity bridge loan. If you add those two together, they're typically close to 90% of the overall cost of the project, and you as a developer will have to come up with 10% equity to put in. Once it reaches COD, the project, the tax equity investor will come in and pay off that bridge loan. That construction loan, again, will be sized exactly the same as the permanent loan. We'll just convert over to a permanent loan and start amortizing on the schedule that we've just discussed. You know, if it's a 20-year PPA, it'll amortize over 20 years. 10 years, it'll amortize over 10. And then again, the maturity is typically inside of that period of time, typically in the 7 to 10 year range, which will just be a refinancing event. The two structures that are typical now in the renewable space, debt structures, are what we'll call project level structure, where the lender is lending directly to the project or the box where the project sits. And then there's something called a back leverage structure, which the lender is lending to a box above the project where the sponsor's equity sits. The trend is definitely moving towards doing more back lever deals. And that's because that tax equity investor who is typically investing their money at the project level does not want to have the project levered up at that level. They don't want the lender to come in and foreclose on their project or have the ability to do so, because that would cause some recapture issues. So because tax equity is such a scarce resource and debt is so widely available, we as lenders somehow have agreed to structurally be behind that tax equity investor in these back lever deals. And if there is an incident of something happening in the first 5 years, we have agreed to stand still. We can foreclose on the sponsor's equity, but we can't foreclose on the project until that tax equity investor flips out. So the trend in the marketplace is definitely more towards back leverage structures versus project level structures. And that's largely because tax equity is so scarce and debt's so widely available. They've just used their leverage to pushes behind them.
Thanks, Andy, for that presentation. There's a lot of great information, and it's very detailed and very familiar for my development side of my practice as we try to get these projects organized into the financing stage. A lot of those concepts you discussed are things we focus on in due diligence and in the work that we're doing for the project developers. But I'd be remiss to not remind you that our course name has P3 in it, and we need to address that issue a little bit. And I think we can have some conversation around that. I don't see it very often, and as you've indicated, we really don't see P3 in the development stage of these projects. And when I say P3, I think of tax exempt financing with some sort of governmental agency involved. So why aren't we seeing that in this stage of these projects and financing at this stage of the project?
Yeah, Brian, that's a good question, and it's largely because the tax benefits that are available through the tax equity investor are so much greater than the benefits received by doing a tax exempt financing. So if you're a tax exempt entity looking to finance their renewable project, you're just going to be better off economically by finding a third party to buy those tax equity, all the tax benefits, versus financing it, using tax exempt debt. It's just economically much better.
Andy, I know that the tax investment credits over the next few years are going to be scaled back. Is there some point at which tax exempt or P3 financing may be more attractive?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There is a whole slew of projects that have been financed the way I just described, that again, that tax equity investor is typically exits after year 5, and the recapture, you could then, once they exit the project, you can finance it any way you want, so it eliminates any recapture risk that tax equity investor has. So I think going forward, if you're able to access that tax exempt financing, it makes all the sense in the world to do that once the tax equity investor exits the project. And I do see that happening, one, because the tax benefits are sunsetting, and 2, because there is a tremendous amount of projects already built that are now getting to that period of time where they're through that first 5 years and getting that tax equity investor out.
Is there a dollar amount that a project kind of needs to meet in order for the tax equity financing structure to work? Is there a deal too small or a deal too large?
Well, that's interesting. Tax equity is a very scarce resource, especially this year with corporate profits being down because of COVID. There's less taxable income and there's less investor demand for this product. So if you have the ability to go out and be a tax equity investor, it's really a buyer's market for them. But the smaller developers that are struggling on smaller deals, to your point, who don't have necessarily tax equity relationships with those type of investors, or never haven't established one, they are certainly at a disadvantage, because those tax equity investors will tend to go to larger developers that they may probably have a track record with, versus going to some of these smaller opportunities with developers that may have less of a track record with smaller deals. So yeah, it's definitely an unlevel playing field. The smaller deals will tend to suffer because of the lack of tax equity in the marketplace. So that's how I'd answer that question.
Yeah, and that's why you see some of the smaller developers selling the projects early in the development cycle, maybe to some of the larger developers that have more of a national presence and have those tax equity relationships. It's a very hot market in the development world to get those projects to a point where someone could then buy it and finish out the development cycle and then get it to the point where it can be financed. So, Laura, I'm gonna have a question for you to transition maybe a little bit away from the tax equity. We focused on renewable projects and that being the primary financing tool at this point in the game. But in your practice, are you seeing P3 projects on the tax exempt side that really fit the energy industry?
More and more. We've done quite a bit of work with colleges, universities, and it originated in student housing and parking structures, those types of things. But we've seen that morph into energy financing, and in particular, steam and water chill plants, those types of facilities, some very large scale projects recently in the Midwest. And so, yes, we are seeing that happen more and more, not so much in the renewables as we've talked about. But yes, we are seeing some of that. The Ohio State, the University of Idaho, and so a few smaller projects. Yes, we are seeing that. Andy, I don't know if this is a concern, but with the new Biden administration coming on board in January, do you all anticipate any changes in the regulations or in the phase out? Is that something that the Biden administration might revisit?
That's a good question. I can say this: we suspect it's going to be better. We suspect he's obviously a little bit more pro renewables than the current administration, and we expect there'll be some type of enhancement to encourage more renewable development. We're just not sure what that is, but it's pretty good right now, and with his administration, it's only going to get better. Yeah, I think the other thing that in talking about where these tax exempt entities will play, as I mentioned, there's now enough critical mass of renewable projects that have been operating for 5 or so years. And as these municipalities and other load serving entities that have access to tax exempt debt, as they continue to go out there and try to deliver more green options to their customers, I see them acquiring many of these projects that have been operating for 5 or so years. Because a lot of those projects are owned by private equity, and private equity typically doesn't own these things for their entire life. So in the future, I see a lot more opportunity for P3 or entities that are load serving, and especially in the tax exempt world, to acquire projects and finance them with tax exempt debt.
I mean, is it too generic just to ask whether or not, Andy, you see more or less opportunity for energy investment financing, either in the tax credit world or in the P3 tax exempt financing? I mean, what do you foresee as the future?
Well, again, I think there's going to be, as these tax credits phase out, and we're a big proponent of that because of my earlier comments, it does create a little bit of an unlevel playing field where some developers have access to tax credits, tax equity, and others don't. It really creates an unlevel playing field, but as those get phased out, I do think you're going to see a lot more interest from municipalities, traditional tax exempt issuers in actually owning, acquiring, not just entering into PPAs, but owning these projects and acquiring them and financing them using tax exempt debt. I welcome that day because tax equity is a very complicated, time-consuming, expensive source of capital that easily, you'll love this, Brian, doubles legal costs in a project. So I welcome the day where that gets phased out, and quite frankly, tax equity, I contend, is artificially pushing down the price of power. These projects, wind or solar, can stand alone on their own. The only thing that tax equity is doing is it's really, when a utility puts out an RFP or a corporation, it's just allowing the people who have it to offer a lower price. But that lower price is, even without the tax benefits, the price is at or usually below the current going rate.
Yeah.
So it's really needed going forward. And I think, once we get rid of those tax incentives, it will open it up to much more broader audience of P3 investors.
Yeah, and the demand's going to be there for renewables, right? So if the tax equity goes away and price jumps up 5 cents a kilowatt hour, it's not going to probably materially slow down the development of these projects, because there's still going to be companies and other purchasers who want that type of power.
That's right. And the other thing we haven't spoken about is storage. In storage, there are currently no incentives with storage, and that is another area that I think is just right for P3 investors, is the storage area. So I think that's coming like a freight train, and everybody's looking at it, and it's definitely here, and we need it because of the intermittency of these renewables. So storage for sure is an area that I suspect is going to get bigger immediately in the P3 space.
Thank you, Andy and Laura, for your comments today, and thank you for joining us today on this presentation. As a reminder, this video was provided by Frost Brown Todd and its affiliate FBT Project Advisors, and presented on CDFA TV.